Okay, should we get started? Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wasallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So if people want to pull up the hadith, it's hadith number 7 in the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. We started, I think, in January looking at the book, right? It wasn't in September, right? It was in January. Yeah. We've been going through each hadith pretty concisely. I know some of you weren't here when we were doing this last time. There's a lot of people who are going to be joining us from the next time. But we want to just wrap up hadith number 7. So if people want to pull it up really quick, we'll go through that. Maghrib is going to be in like an hour and 20 minutes. Then we're going to have iftar, so feel free to stick around till then. We'll go until Maghrib time, and then we'll break for iftar, and then we won't resume after. Next week we might start at 6:30 instead of 6 o'clock. Just people coming out of work. 6:30 is a little bit easier than 6 p.m. As Maghrib's getting later also. But we'll keep people updated on the email list. So if you want to just open up the hadith number 7, we can just read the Arabic and the English if people want to pull it open. Inshallah, does anybody have it in front of them? Does anybody feel like reading?
I have the English.
You can read the English. Go for it.
On the authority of Tamim al-Dari, that the Prophet said, religion is sincerity. We said, to whom? He said, to Allah and His book and His messenger, and to the leaders of the Muslims and their common folk.
Great. Does anybody want to read the Arabic?
Do it slowly.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. وَلِأَئِمَّةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ, like the imams of the Muslim, the a'imma, وَعَامَّتِهِمْ. Yeah, jazakallah khair. So we talked about this hadith and got through the part where it's says to the prophets, right? So Tamim ad-Dari radiallahu an, when we spoke about him, so we looked at his biography. Every one of these hadith, we've been looking at the companion, learning a little bit about who they are and what it is that brings of their personality and their lived experience to us being able to extrapolate a little bit more meaning from the hadith. So Tamim ad-Dari radiallahu an, he was a convert to Islam that came from a monk background. Amongst like some of the things that we discussed about him, he was the first person to bring lanterns into the Prophet's mosque, right? So if you conceptualize kind of Medina in the time of Revelation, there's no lights the way we have lights here. And trying to think about, well, what does that mean conceptually? Like, he literally brings light into the masjid. You know, so when you're in the masjid at Fajr time, getting there kind of in the early part of Fajr and it's very dark, or Isha comes and it's just very late at night. You can imagine what it was like for people praying like their night prayers in the darkness of the night. Tamim ad-Dari, amongst the many things that he's known for, he brings like literal lanterns into the masjid. Do you know? And we're not going to go into too much like who he is. If you didn't kind of have time to be here for the other ones or listen to them online, you can pick up on that. But one of the key words in this hadith that we want to revisit before we go is the word nasiha, which we quite often hear just in terms of advice and counsel. It has more of the sense of kind of sincerity to it. in terms of kind of purification. There's a verse in the Quran that talks about tawbah, that's nasuha, right? Like a very kind of sincere tawbah when you turn back to God. So it's not a advising kind of tawbah, but one that has an inner self that's really present. You know, some of the examples that are made of this is like when a person who is a tailor kind of pieces together cloth that's been kind of separated. You know, this is the idea of kind of bringing something together with that sense of sincerity. But for the purposes of this hadith, the way we were describing it is just sincere conduct, right? Adinu nasiha, the deen is nasiha. Qulna liman, the companions say, to who, O Messenger of God? And he says, قال لله ولكتابه ولرسوله ولأمة المسلمين وعامتهم, that it's sincere conduct to the divine, to his book, to his messengers, to the leaders of the Muslims, and to the common people. We're going to talk about the last two categories today, and then jump into hadith number 8 next week. But that's the frame of how we're thinking about this, right? Sincere conduct, not in terms of like advice or counsel, the way someone might say, but that's going to be a part of it when we come back to the end part of this hadith. And it fundamentally gives a breakdown of every way that you and I, as an individual practitioner of this religion, can relate to everything we fundamentally have capacity to relate to. So as a Muslim, you're going to have sincere conduct with God. You're going to have sincere conduct with God's messenger, with God's book. You're going to have sincere conduct with the people who run things. And you're going to have sincere conduct with just everybody else who's around you. And this is fundamentally like a frame that is subjective back to the individual. What does it mean that I have like good conduct with you? How is there a sense of sincerity that comes into this? Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, rahimahullah, when you're talking about like love and fear, and we want to think about sincere conduct with some of these things, because you can think about sincerity to the divine in the sense that I believe in a God that's an angry old man in the sky looking for a reason to punish me. Or I can think about God as how he identifies himself to us first. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, right? This is what he chooses to tell us about, but it gives a baseline of love, like something that's more positive. So Al-Fudayl, what he says is that if you're going to choose either love or fear, in the terms of how you conduct yourself with someone, you're going to want to choose love. Because if you have love for someone, then out of your love for them, you're going to do what you know they want you to do, whether they're there or not, right? But if you have fear of somebody, then you'll be a certain way in their presence, but in their absence, you're not going to necessarily be the same way as you would if there was love present. Does that make sense? So like my kids, inshallah they love me, right? My son Kareem, my daughter Medina, is 8, 11-year-old. My daughter's like a really good girl. I don't know how else to explain it. Do you know? My son, he's also a really good kid, mashallah. But it's a little bit different. I think he's more kind of, you know, a little diva-ish like his father is. And his sister, she's like not that way, you know? But Medina will be in a place where even when we're away, and even Kareem, we just know that they're going to do what it is that we know that they're going to do. Doesn't mean they're not going to make mistakes, right? They're children. But fundamentally, because there's a level of love that we have that's reciprocated, my wife and I can like leave the house and leave them together, and we know they're not going to do crazy things, right? Like we went out somewhere last night, and my 8-year-old and I were walking down the street, and he said, "Baba, what time are you leaving?" And I like held him really close. I was like, "Are you going to throw a party while I'm gone?" And he was like, "Baba, what are you talking about?" And I was like, "Kareem, don't do," like, you know, I was joking around with him. But there's a love that's there that enables them to not have to then feel as if they have to act out in ways that come from being suffocated by fear and anxiety. A very kind of dark prism of how it is we engage religion that then has us in this place where there's not awe of the divine, but a sense of just scrutinization, that you don't believe in a God that's watching over you, but just one that's watching you. Do you get what I mean? And sincere conduct has to have that element of like mahabba to it, love, so that you are who you are, and there's sincerity in conduct, whether you're standing like in the 27th night of Ramadan, or you're standing in, the third night of Rabiul Awwal, right? It's just love. So there's consistency where there's love. You are who you are, whether your mom is watching you or not. You are who you are, whether your dad is watching you or not. Do you know what I mean? Like, the love enables you to find a strength that sincere conduct resonates a little bit differently, because love gives you courage, and loving gives you strength in a way that fear just fundamentally doesn't do those things. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to summate some of what we talked about for about 4 weeks before Ramadan started, so that we can get to a place when we're talking this now about sincerity, nasiha to Allah, to His messengers, to His books, to the leaders, and to the common people. We're not thinking about it in a prism of sincerity that's just like rote expressions of things from our tongue, but it's rooted in ethics and values that we can demonstrate metrics of assessment of how we possess them based off of how we fundamentally interact and who we are when there's people around us versus who we are when there's nobody else around us. Do you know what I mean? And I have a sphere that's my public sphere versus a sphere that's like my private sphere versus a third arena that's just a place of secrecy. Because I could be a certain way around you, and I could be a certain way around my family, and that could be a third way when it's just me by myself. And in all of those arenas, it's where is there sincere conduct? Where is there an honoring of those relationships that we have with Allah, His book, His messenger, the authoritative figures, as well as people who are common people? Does that make sense? Yeah? Are we sure? Okay. So what I'd like for us to do, just so we can start getting talking, I know people had a long day. Some of you might be fasting after you had multiple days of Eid, foods and leftovers and whatever else. How does this kind of resonate with what you understand nasiha to be? If you were to think out sincere conduct in relation to these 5 categories, why is this something that's so important? The Hadith is essentially making an equal sign. The deen, religion, right, is nasiha. That's just what it is. It doesn't mean that there's not other things that make up this deen, but the Hadith is very concise because it's showing the importance of this. So how do we understand this? What are different ways we can break this down? I'm talking about love as a necessary variable. What are other things that might come into play when we're trying to identify and give to us a sense of metrics of how I can actualize this in my implementation of it? So if you can turn to the person that's next to you, what are you taking away so far? And how does it inform for you an understanding of what nasiha is? And then we'll come back and kind of plunge into the Hadith. But go ahead, just so people can get started talking to each other. If you don't know people's names around you, share some names. Yeah.
And that's not necessarily just between families,
So it's a big, in any community.
and then also just acting as a
That makes it yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a good point.
Mark Twain quote has a scene where he says it's better we tell the truth.
Yeah. That's probably what you said, yeah.
Yes. So when you operate with the level of sincerity, you're not advantage of that. You're not interested be truthful to yourself,
And maybe they read
I've heard of it, never actually, yeah. Every accent on self-insurance. That's what a lot of people say. But what if it was like deeper than that? You know what I mean? There's a lot of people out there.
Guys, you should. You tell them to come pray over here. You should come pray over here. Because then people will start crowding near the door. No, it's okay. Then people will start crowding near the door. So.
Because I don't prefer it like this. I can't focus.
Okay, whatever's comfortable for you. Yeah, go ahead. So what are some of the things we're talking about? What do we discuss? Who wants to start? Yeah.
I guess I'll go. We were just talking, and when you mentioned it, the first thing that popped in my head was of all things, a Mark Twain quote, where he said, "It's better to tell the truth. That way you don't have to remember anything." And I attach that to sincerity, because when you operate with a level of sincerity, you're not seeking to manipulate people. You're not seeking to lie to yourself or lie to the people around you. You're operating within a state of truthfulness. And when you operate in a state of truthfulness, it's just, there's more, I don't know the word for it in English, like there's more benefit, there's more lessons within that kind of mindset.
Yeah, 100%. So like trust, integrity, honesty is like a part of this. Do you know what I mean? What else? You think Nazia should say something? Is that what you're saying?
I do.
Yeah, what should she say?
You made a really great point. I'm gonna butcher it. I'm gonna butcher it now, but she was saying how a big part of love is trust. So I know we just spoke about trust, but I think connecting love and trust together is really important because see, now I forgot there.
Basically,
Thank
the
you.
foundation of love in any, not like relationship, like any relationship you have has to be some form of trust in the other person to have your back or to have your best interest in mind. So if you're looking at religion from that perspective, it's much easier when you're able to fully, in theory, I'm not saying I have this down or anything like that, it's much easier to follow religion and to follow the Quran or the Sira, whatever you want to take it, if you have a level of trust that it is in your best interest and it will give you an outcome in life that is for the best. But without that level of trust, it's not. It just makes life, it makes religion harder because you don't fully understand what the outcome will be unless you have that level of trust.
Yeah, great. Sorry, you're going to say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I feel like the thought of sincerity, like it kind of just guides every aspect of life. So whether you're interacting with like people or like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran, just like it's a good way of kind of thinking about how to live your life.
Yeah, so, and in this tradition, there's no intermediaries between you and any of these things. And that's very purposeful. So the first three that we talked about a lot before, we're not going to get into so much today, but when the hadith says, right, قَالَ لِلَّهِ وَلِكِتَابِهِ وَلِرَسُولِهِ, that you have nasiha to Allah and to His book and to His messenger, a lot of us build a relationship to Allah and His book and His messenger through somebody else. Think about if my relationship to my wife was done through you. Like you told me what I should think about my wife as opposed to me building a relationship with my wife. You would say, that sounds ridiculous, like what you're saying, right? But a lot of us have a conceptualization of the divine that isn't coming straight from the divine. So we know who Allah is because people told us when we were little, like if we don't do this, then we're bad. And if we don't do this, then it's haram. And if we don't do this, then you're going to hell. And it creates a conceptualization of God. But that conceptualization of God didn't come from God or His book or His messenger. Similarly with the Quran, right? Like a lot of us engage the Quran for an entire month of Ramadan. May Allah accept from us. But to be able to think about the relationship we have with the Quran, it's not in a judgmental way, but just objectively speaking. It sits on shelves quite often. There's not a regular engagement or reading of it. So the trust within the kind of original part to the relationship becomes diminished if there's something that you're going through that is actually setting for you a standard of the one that you're building a relationship with. Do you get what I mean? Right? Like, I've known Danny Iqbal for many years. I can tell you all kinds of things about him. Do you know? But if you never met him, and you only knew about him through what I would tell you about him, does that give you a fully accurate depiction of who he is in his entirety? And what if I don't like him? Right? Like the way I like my kids. I don't ever sit up here and tell you things that create like a shadow of doubt upon my wife or my children, God forbid. I just tell you nice things about them, you know? And you walk out of here likely thinking, man, like those are some nice people, right? It's a different frame than what we have when there's only fear or negativity associated with things that are foundational aspects of our religion. If you relate to Allah and His book and His messenger through a prism of negativity that's been channeled to you through somebody who's spoken on God's behalf or God's messenger's behalf or given you a perspective of God's book that keeps you from having sincere conduct. Because if I said, this guy is like a creepy guy, don't talk to him so much, because of the trust you have in me, a lot of you would already say, we're not going to talk to Danny Iqbal. Do you know what I mean? Right? You can't treat Allah that way. And the impediment to sincere conduct or love does not necessarily become a product of what we're bringing into the relationship, but what somebody else might have brought into the relationship that impacts that sincere conduct, but nonetheless is keeping it from reaching its potential high point. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? This is why like gossiping is really haram. Because not only are you hurting somebody when you speak poor of them, you're hurting somebody else's perception of someone that they don't know anything about. And so when you think about people who now do this with the divine, or they do it with Allah's book, that only certain people are supposed to read Allah's book, or you take understandings of Quran from people who are Orientalists, or people who are supremacists, people who are deeply entrenched in their anti-blackness, and they make you want to internalize racism and hate your religion. You get to a place where Allah's messenger is somebody who you've never read his seerah or understood his sunnah, but you were only taught to pray your sunnah prayers before you were taught whose sunnah you were following. How can you have full love that yields this sincere conduct if you don't even know who it is you're building the relationship with? Do you get what I mean? And then little things make a big difference. You walk into a space and there's a ton of people, but you don't notice the person that nobody's talking to because you're talking to everybody else. You're setting a standard for that individual now to be able to understand who are Muslims, and in turn, how do these Muslims represent Quran? There's a woman I met in the UK when I was sitting with a group of converts. There was like 6 or 7 of them. We were in Denmark, I think, maybe not the UK, and having dinner. There's one lady who came from a Sikh background, and she said, it took me 7 years to decide to become Muslim. And I said, why did it take you 7 years? And she said, everything in this religion made sense. The Quran was magnificent. It just took me 7 years to meet Muslims who actually resembled what this book talked about. But the reasons why people don't resemble the book isn't necessarily because everybody's just a terrible human being. But sometimes the way we understand the book and its purpose in our life comes from people who didn't necessarily do justice to us in relation to it. And it becomes hard to build love when there's so much other stuff that's there. Do you get what I mean? Does that make sense? Does it?
Yes.
Yeah. So you can't be in a place where the conduct is measured just purely on externals. A lot of this is going to be rooted in internals. And when he's saying the deen is nasiha, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a deenun nasiha, it's sincere conduct towards these things. The base of it is not just in the performance of acts, because you could get a parrot to say la ilaha illallah, right? You could get, you literally, right? I know, because I'm in WhatsApp groups with a lot of you, where you have like pictures of cats wearing scarves, prostrating on prayer mats. Do you know what I mean? It's not hard to get something to do something outwardly. It's hard to build those components, especially when you live in a world that doesn't teach you to look at your heart, but rather tells you to make decisions at its expense and not through it. Yeah.
How does, because growing up I went to a traditionally predominantly Bengali mosque, and just growing up within my community, as I'm getting older, I feel like a lot of what we were taught was probably cultural and religious, and sometimes they package them both together, and they taught you based off of that, and they use fear-mongering on top of that. How does one unpack the cultural part?
Well, Bengali culture is beautiful, just like every culture is beautiful, right?
Do that also.
But you want to think when you distill it, because something sounds like it is applicable, but then you'll buy into the words, but you're meaning something else, right? Religion needs culture to exist. It can't exist devoid of culture. And what makes Islam so beautiful, it doesn't buy into this rugged sense of individualism that you find in the prism of modernity that is a byproduct of supremacy, right? Egocentricity then kind of idolizes the individual to this way. So there's a lot of really great things about everybody's culture that's in this room, but there's also certain things that could become potentially problematic that when culture becomes hegemonic in its attitude towards religion. But more so what I hear from what you're saying is you got to unlearn some of the things that you have learned in order to then be able to say, why do I see it this way, right? And if your heart has capacity, it doesn't have just infinite capacity to hold, but it's finite. So if it holds like things that you found indirectly or directly from when you were young, then you acknowledge it. And you have to be able to say, well, like, I don't have to envy these people. When I read the Quran, like, and I read the Hadith in my late teens trying to figure out what religion means to me, and I was being very honest with myself, I didn't believe in the God that seemingly this book was talking about. And it didn't seem to me that I believed in the God that the Prophet Abraham was talking about, the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam was talking. I didn't even think about God in these ways. So it came from someplace. The goal in addressing what it has to be unlearned can be rooted in framing it in, well, this is what brought me to this place, but it's sometimes too broad of a statement. Do you know? Because it then now casts continuity to what it is that we're trying to stop. There's things problematic in every culture, and I'm sure, as somebody who's not Bengali, that there's things that are problematic in Bengali culture, just like there's things that are problematic in Pakistani culture, in Kashmiri culture, in Punjabi culture. Do you know what I mean? But it's not necessarily the culture that creates the challenge, because it's just a tool fundamentally. The way I can use my laptop to like read hadith, I can use my laptop to like do haram, you know? Like, it's an extension of me. And there's a lot of people who are really amazing in every culture. There's also people who are real idiots in every culture. We want to get to the base of like what creates idiocy. And potentially one of the parts of it is that, well, religion stops being fundamentally about like faith and theology, and it fundamentally then focuses purely on what is outward and ritualistic. But if you don't have an inner part to a practice, then it's like a corpse. There's no life to it, right? You can't have a body without a soul. Do you know what I mean? So I would say here, like what our brother Kamal is saying, is like, what I take from it is like, a lot of us have to unlearn and unpack a lot of things. And where we didn't have room to explore it, we'll have a phrase that has validity to it. It doesn't mean there's not validity, but the phrase comes up that then looks for something that we fundamentally can't go against to be able to then remedy some of what it is. And it gives continuity in our heart to something that can be toxic, right? You don't want to hate like your cultural heritage. You want to love your cultural heritage and reclaim your cultural heritage in a way that synergizes with the religion that makes it robust. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Right? So if we say culture is the problem, it's like very broad. Do you know? It's like, no, man, like that guy that went to Sunday school that said to the other teacher in front of me when I was 12, when I don't know the answer, I just make up an answer. You know, that person was a problem in teaching me about who God was. Do you see what I mean? And I could be like, man, these Pakistanis, you know, but it has nothing to do with them being Pakistani. And then there is some stuff that is deeply rooted in culture that the Hadith tells us, take from it everything that's good, but when it starts to contradict what like our texts tell us, then you got to leave it behind. Do you know? So if your culture is down with forced marriage, then that's not rooted in the prophetic example. If your culture validates racism, that's like the foundational like sin that takes shaitan out of paradise. Do you get what I mean? Right? And there are some parts of our culture, but it's like too broad of a statement that I know that's not what you're intending to say, but we want to like start to distill some of these things. The Prophet's nature wasn't to make dua against an entire demographic of people or like an entire country of population. Do you get what I mean? Like he acknowledged there was like good that came out of the Romans. There were good that came out of the Persians and the Byzantines. Do you know there was good that came out of like the Najashi's community in Abyssinia? Do you know? So there wasn't like broader kind of things that said all of this is just categorically bad. Do you get what I mean? So you unlearn some of it so that you can say, I want to feel these things. This is what Maulana Rumi says, that your goal is to not seek out beauty, to seek out love. Your goal is to merely find everything that you have built within yourself that's an obstacle towards it. What keeps me from seeing beauty? What keeps me from seeing goodness? Why do I feel like I'm walking around on eggshells when it comes to religion? Do you get what I mean? And the metrics aren't that like you stand on a prayer mat and then you're just bawling in tears every time you pray, right? That's also like a very kind of surface level understanding, because real faith is you get it done even when you don't want to get it done. Do you know what I mean? It'd be amazing if everything was this spiritually intoxicating experience, but it's not. But when you have love, you're not worshiping the feeling, you're worshiping the one who gave you the feelings, and you're saying, like, I trust Allah, so I know even if I'm just like banging out these 2 rak'ahs at Fajr time and I'm super exhausted, I'm doing it because I know He wouldn't tell me to do something that's not good for me. Do you get what I mean? And then the person who teaches you religion, do you think they had your best interest in mind when they were teaching it to you? Or were they just throwing words at you? And then you have to acknowledge that, right? When you go to college or high school or elementary school, do you remember who was like a good teacher to you? Like teachers who stood out, that they had genuine care for you. They wanted you to excel. That's who the prophet of God is. And somebody taints that image, that's a problem. Do you know? Does that make sense? Yeah? So here we want to think about this. What is sincere conduct in this regard? And it's not about attaching actions to certain things, right? If you loved me, you would do this. Can also be an abusive construct or a manipulative construct. Do you know what I mean? So if I tell my son, if you really love me, you would make your bed, right? He's 8 years old. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't not love me. He's just an 8-year-old. He can't remember half the time where he left his shirts and whatever else. Do you know? Right? But what I grow up with in an unhealthy understanding of an emotion, I have to be able to acknowledge that I bring that into a relationship. The same way that when I get married, I need to know what I'm bringing in terms of clutter and garbage into it. So too, I'm having a relationship with Allah and His book and His messenger. I got to acknowledge what's all the clutter that's coming with me into this relationship. Do you see what I mean? And here, like sincere conduct, you just try your best. You know who Allah is. You know like that He knows you better than you know yourself. And then you engage with a deep sincerity that sometimes what gets in the way is the middle person, or the person that was conveying wasn't like necessarily thinking about me when they were giving me information. It was just, let me like kind of throw it at somebody. Do you know what I mean? Does this make sense? So we want to move to these last 2 categories, right? لِأَمَّةِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَعَامَّتِهِمْ, like for the a'imma of the Muslims, the people who are the leaders of the Muslims and the common people. What do you think would demonstrate sincere conduct to people who are in authoritative positions? And just in the interest of time, right? Like this would be divided in most kind of texts into 2 groups. Like people who are leaders kind of in a scholarly capacity, like religious scholars. And then people who are in other modes of leadership. That could be like a king, a khalifa, a president, right? It could be, thinking about this from the standpoint of nasiha, sincere conduct, to whoever's in a place of leader. Like the Prophet says, "Kullukum ra'in," that all of you are shepherds and all of you are responsible for your flocks. So as a father, I can't be responsible for my flock if I don't spend time with my flock. If you're always elsewhere and you're not with your kids, then you're not shepherding your flock. Do you get what I mean? If you are like the imam of your house, the imam of your family, you're the imam of like these different things, right? And the Prophet says this, so this is just true. Kullukum ra'in. All of you are shepherds, meaning you have responsibility towards something. So there's some capacity of leadership that we embody in our day to day. So in this hadith, when we're talking about nasiha to the a'imma of the Muslims, what do we think that would mean? Like, how would we understand sincere conduct to those who are in leadership positions? Religious scholars, as well as those who fit into other categories. And why this is important to understand is that religious leadership is not the only frame of leadership that we have. And individually, we have responsibility. Accountability comes to us because we have responsibility to people, right? Just like was just said right here, where you have people who taught you about Islam, and they might not have taught you right, there's going to be responsibility on the day of judgment. May Allah grant them and us ease. Do you know? But we want to think about this twofold. Like, how do we give this nasiha, and how are we also willing to receive it simultaneously? But what does this look like? So if somebody said, well, what is sincere conduct to people in positions of authority? What would you say? So if you can turn to the persons next to you for 2-3 minutes, like, what does this look like? What does that mean? And why is it an important part in this hadith? And then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead.
So as far as it comes to like leadership and like, I come from the perspective.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting perspective.
I speak that. So my job is essentially dog on so, deal with a lot of different emotions. And it's also very interesting to see, I think sincerity, there's also levels of respect, center of trust in the leadership. And also education. In a sense, if you're operating at a level of authority, that's kind of
That's really good. Also, I mean, to that, you could like extend that to, I guess, but yeah, just like, yeah, it's a very broad word. I mean, it can be. It's a really important word. I think what we should think about how every relationship is like based off of trust. It's also based off of sincerity. And like you want, nobody's going to be friends with somebody or like choose someone that they believe. So like there is that level of sincerity and trust. And some of a lot of times it's easy to like let everybody think about it and see things about like, you know what I mean, as opposed to like sitting down and like that trust. If you truly have complete trust in it, then like these things will just hear and go with it and be like, well, there's a reason for this, and like because I trust it.
It's also, I know as a teacher, I said
yeah.
Everybody is like a bad kid. Later be like, so there is that level of this person.
That's a really good point.
I'm not saying
That's really interesting. What Ernie's thing is really interesting that you were saying about how organizations that is. But I mean, like, also everybody has a story too, I'm sure. Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's more nuanced than Yeah, it really is. I honestly, so like when I was a college student, this was like my community, so it was very easy. And I went to med school, and I went to med school in Vegas, of all places. So like I like moved from this, like it was just like all socialization was like based on so it was just such a different like community. And you know, that's American. That's even Western culture. So you really have to like look out for yourself.
Okay, so what are some of the things we're talking about? Like, what do we draw from this sincere conduct with leaders of the Muslims? Yeah.
So we were kind of discussing about this whole concept of acquired learning and inherited learning. So acquired, so a lot of times, like especially when we're younger, we inherit a lot of information from like, for example, our parents without really questioning it. And I think that's when we run into a lot of conflicts. Whereas acquired learning is when you actually go out of your way to do research and sort of understand the information that's provided to you, whether it's coming from a scholar, whether it's coming from your parents, your friends. So really take the time to kind of like put in the research and understand religion and your relationship with God. So
Great. Other thoughts? How would this look, like sincere conduct to someone in a position of authority? Yeah.
I was brought up at a really cool point. Wait, my bad. I'm just gonna.
That's Harth. This is.
Oh. That like a quote from Martin Luther Jr. I forget it, but the overall concept is like civil disobedience could be like sincerity to a leader. Like if there's rules that are unjust, then like you don't follow those rules as like a form of sincerity to the leader, and I guess like other people that think that as well. I thought it was really good.
Yeah. And so if we extrapolate a principle from this, one of the main things of this part is that nobody is beyond advice. Every single person has capacity to make a mistake. Everybody has something that they could be doing that they shouldn't be doing, or could be improved upon, or could take some kind of counsel. So that means, like, in the stages of life that we're in right now, the people who are elder than us are also people who could still stand to have beneficial counsel as a part of sincere conduct, as well as those who are younger than us. But as we move through various phases of existence, there's never a time in any of our stages of life that we are somehow beyond getting some type of nasiha. If the people who are the leaders of the Muslims, right? This is a hadith that's coming up at a time from the Prophet ﷺ towards the latter part of their time in Medina, right? Because the narrator, Tamim ad-Dari, he takes a shahada like at this time, you know? And so this is why you want to know the biographies of these people so you can contextualize, well, what's really going on here? He's not speaking to them about this in Mecca where they're getting persecuted and beaten and boycotted, but this is where they have an established community, an established state. And so then you see when there's movement forward in leadership that there's a constant willingness for there to be feedback given to the people who are running their communities. Umar radiallahu an, he's in a place where the king of Rome sends somebody after he establishes the caliphate. He takes on to be the second Khalifa, and he sends someone to go see how Umar is, and to essentially like assassinate him. And when he comes into Medina, and this man is in a tree hiding to see how Umar like lives his life, he sees Umar like asleep at the base of a tree, utilizing a stone as a pillow with no guards. And what they say of him is that you were just, so you were safe. But he's in a place where he's honoring the rights of people, so he doesn't need like an entire entourage of people that are going to make sure that nobody comes and does something problematic to him. Do you know? And throughout his post like conversion life. Umar radiallahu anh is the 40th person to take Shahada. And when he comes within like normative Sunni understanding of Islam, he's seen as like a very key figure in the development of Muslim communal kind of representation. They can go out for the first time in public and like just be, and no one's bothering them. Do you know? He goes and he knocks on the door of Abu Jahl, and he's excited to see his champion, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who makes life difficult. Right? He says, Marhaban ya Umar. And Umar says to him, Aslamtu, that I became Muslim. And he says, La taf'al, don't do this. And he says, Fa'alt, it's done. And then there's nothing that can be done, because they can't do anything to this man. Do you know? And they're now praying in the confines of the Kaaba for the first time. They're walking through the streets. He's got like this reputation, and there's consistency of people challenging him. You know, he tries to limit the meher for women, and a woman stands up in the middle of his sermon and says, who are you to put a ceiling on something that Allah did not put any type of limit on for us, right? And Umar starts to cry. And he says, everybody is more knowledgeable than I am. Do you know? He walks through the streets as the Khalifa in the nighttime, and he comes upon a woman who is stirring a pot, feigning having food, because she's got nothing to feed her starving kids, and she's waiting for them to cry themselves to sleep so that they are just exhausted and avoid understanding their hunger. And when Umar sees what's happening, he goes and brings like food from his own kind of place of food, and then she doesn't know who he is, so she says, you're better than the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Khalifa. And he says, why? And she says that he's entrusted to be responsible for taking care of all of us, and he is not, but you are fulfilling that trust. And Umar starts to cry and says, everybody's better than Umar. Do you know? This is a man who, in our tradition, the Prophet says, لَوْ كَانَ نَبِيًّا بَعْدِي لَكَانَ عُمَرٌ, that if there was a messenger after me, it would be this man Umar. And this is his understanding of himself and his leadership. From the standpoint of foundational ethics in our tradition, there's just humility that becomes the counter to unchecked ego, entitlement, egocentricity, exceptionalism that is breeded in this country. Do you know what I mean? They don't want to hear nothing from nobody about how they're doing things. Then you get unchecked egos that they could care less that there's migrants sleeping in the street. They could care less that there's babies dying every single day around the world from weapons that we're sending overseas. They could fundamentally care less because there's no sincerity that understands that we are not beyond reproach. That just because I have wealth and influence and affluence doesn't mean that you cannot tell me that I need to be kept in check. Do you get what I'm saying? So a big part of this, that there's nasiha to the a'imma of the Muslims, is that the people who are in leadership positions, they got to be ready to take advice and counsel and be recipient of this. How many people do you know that are elders in your communities? They won't hear a word from anybody, right? How many people do you know that they are just not going to hear it from anyone? Abu Huraira has a hadith that he's guarding the Baytul Mal. And some of you probably know this hadith. Shaitan comes to steal in a human form, and he engages Abu Huraira, saying, I'm in need, I need this thing. And the Prophet asks Abu Huraira what happens without Abu Huraira telling him. And he says, like, this man is a liar, this man is a liar. It happens a few times. And then he says, I'm going to take you to the Prophet. And he says, if you don't, I will teach you something. And he tells him that if you recite Ayatul Kursi, it'll keep like the jinn, the shayateen away from you. And so he tells the Prophet, this is what happened. And this is summated, right? Paraphrase. But the Prophet says, like, this man is a liar, but he indeed spoke the truth. Like, this was Iblis who was like telling you these things. Abu Huraira learned something of knowledge from Iblis. Do you understand? Like, the way he knew that you recite the Ayatul Kursi came through the entity that we seek protection from God from on a daily basis. You don't think you can learn something from a child? You don't think you could learn something from a homeless person? You don't think you can learn something from somebody who doesn't have the degree you have, or went to the college you went to, or doesn't have as much money as you went to? So you and I fit into this as much as we are the ones giving it. Nasiha to the people in charge. When you get to your house, you get like kids. Allah blesses you with beautiful babies. You might already have them. You have wealth. You have affluence. You are in a position of authority. You have a job of some kind. You're not beyond your own mistakes. And you have to be in a place where you're willing to actually take some of that. Does it make sense? So, I have friends who I know. I have a friend, his name is Riyad Khan. You might see him here at different times. Tall Trinidadian guy. We hang out all the time. When I ask you all, like, hey, how was that khutbah? Oh, it's so nice. You're so great, so good, right? I'll say, Riyad, what did you think? He was like, here's all the things that were not good. Do you know? My wife, she does not mince words with me. Do you know what I mean? She'll tell me, like, this is what was like this was like that. In a way that is helpful, but I have to surround myself in a community that cares about me with people who also care about me, but they're going to tell it to me straight when I need to hear it. That this is not a good idea, or this is a good idea, or how is what you're doing fit into like more broadly what it is you're trying to achieve? Who are these people in your lives? And at this juncture, there's no fundamental way that any one of us in this room does not have responsibility towards somebody else. You might live in denial of that as a fact, but you still nonetheless have responsibility towards somebody else. And somebody has to be in your life that's going to be able to tell you, hey man, you're being an idiot. Like, you're not doing things right. Here now we also have the idea of how we give sincere conduct to someone who is authoritative. So you get guidelines from our tradition that you're not just putting people on blast constantly. But think about now how you might give advice to someone who is an elder in your life. Somebody that comes from a place that they have an expectation. Ethics are situational in our religion. The way I talk to my 8-year-old is not the way that I'm going to talk to your 80-year-old grandparent when you bring them here. When we stand in line to get food at iftar, and I see somebody who is in a wheelchair, or we see somebody who is old enough to be our grandparents, we're not going to say to them that you should be at the end of the line. We're going to say that you are going to be the first one that we serve, theoretically, right? This is what the adab of our tradition is. And you got to remember who your teacher is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it doesn't matter, like what everybody else thinks is the norm. You have to be comfortable being different and being strange. If being strange is about doing ikram of your elders and your young people, then you do that, right? You treat them with nobility and generosity, because that's what's the right thing to do. Who cares what people on the street are doing? If they're doing something, that's not enough of a reason as to why you should do it that way. But how would you give that kind of advice? Right? Hassan and Hussein, radiallahu anhuma, the grandsons of the Prophet of God, they see an older companion who is not doing wudu correctly. So they don't go to this older man as young children and say, look at how terrible you are at making wudu. This is why you also have to be kind to yourself. The companions who were the best generations, this was an elder companion, he was making a mistake in his wudu. You're going to make mistakes in some of the things that you do. If a companion of the Prophet of God, who's learning Islam directly from the Prophet of God, is going to make a mistake, you don't think you and I are going to make mistakes? So they say, rather than let's just go be blunt with this person, why don't we come up with a way that's going to honor his dignity? And so they go to this older companion and they say, can you judge which one of us makes wudu the best? And then as they're making wudu, they make the mistake that he was making, and then they say to the other, like, hey, that's not this or that. And then they turn to him and say, what do you think? And he acknowledges that they let him maintain his dignity. And in many instances, this is one of the modes we can make sincere conduct to somebody that is in a position of authority. That it doesn't have to be that I'm just going to tear the person down with no sense of compassion. But because ethics are situational, sometimes it does necessitate then taking stronger stances. So there's a reason why these streets still have to be filled with people who are protesting. And to give people indication. When we have 6,000 people in Washington Square Park, and people say, like, I can't believe, like, that, we had, like, all kinds of media that was there, for example. You don't want to be siloed in your perspective. So there was a New York Times article that had people, like, in all kinds of cultural attire, photographs. There was, like, other articles that were more about why we were standing there with the people that were oppressed. If you look at the comments that people were making on some of these things on social media, not Muslims, but like, why are you bringing your religion into the public sphere? Unlike the New York Times article, right? Why don't you go do this in private? You shouldn't be bringing like Islam into the forefront. We're making a statement when we're standing 6,000 strong in the park, and then they see after the fact that we come from these diverse backgrounds, that then creates an understanding, we're here, like we're not going anywhere. Sheikh Sahib Webb led a Jama'ah for Eid of 40,000 people in Sacramento, mashallah. And somebody could say, why do we want to have one big Jama'ah, all these kinds of things. In an election year, as people have been voting uncommitted, as they've been voting in these ways to demonstrate that they're not parts of certain things, and then in California, you have one person leading 40,000 people in a gathering, these politicians are going to be shaking in their boots. That you can get these people together at this time in the morning, all to like be praying in unison. That's why you got to think a little bit more broadly about what some of these things are, and how sometimes the sincerest mode of conduct is to stand with boots on the ground, saying that we're here unapologetically as who we are. It's gonna not always fit into what we think makes the most sense. And this is where another aspect of sincere conduct comes in. The religious scholar, the leader, and the strategist, they're going to try their best to make decisions. And in the public sphere, if you become the mechanism through which there becomes a sense of disorganized connectivity, then people are going to continue to play games with us because they know that we're not organized. So there's a lot of Muslims who they purposely scrutinize religious scholars to purely be able to say, this is why you're wrong and you're making a mistake. That doesn't make us necessarily better. Sometimes it makes us weaker. If you're looking to see where someone is inadequate or deficient, to be able to jump and pounce at where it is that they've slipped without being able to say anything of positivity that they might have contributed within measure, right? Somebody's doing things that are grossly just adding to oppression. It's very different than what we're talking about. But the generic understanding of certain things. You go to most Muslim communities, think about how religious leadership is treated. In a lot of cultures, right, like where my family comes from, the free schools, the way my kids go to public school here, the free schools in the Indian subcontinent are the religious schools. And the elites of those societies, where there's a huge gap between a low income and high income class, creates now disdain because the poor people are the ones who go into religion, not the ones who are affluent. And you have intergenerational understandings that you acquire of religion in these ways. We had a guy that came here in 2008 before this building was built, there was a church that used to serve the university. And there's an Indian film director, Bollywood director. His name is Karan Johar. People know Karan Johar, right? Some of you know who he is. And he had one of his family members was coming because they were doing research for what I think ended up being the movie My Name is Khan, right? Where Shah Rukh Khan is going to tell the president terrorism is bad or something, right? And his kid in the movie is a brown kid that goes to a school where he's the only brown kid, and they essentially it's not funny, but the storyline is pretty interesting. This kid gets harassed and beaten up and bullied, and then the child dies from being pummeled by soccer balls, right, in the movie. This is the way that they're framing this narrative around Islamophobia, etc. When they came here to do research, and we were a much smaller community in 2008, but still a lot of people that were practicing religion as young people like all of you in this room, right? They're coming from a place where he said to me, you're at a college and all these people practice religion here? And I said, yeah. And he said, in my country, educated people do not practice religion of any kind. In my country, the poor people are religious, not the wealthy people or the educated people. These are some of the things that come up. So when you go into a lot of masjids, generalization I'm comfortable meeting, everybody praying behind the imam thinks they're smarter than the imam. Or they think that they're there to just do their bidding and their service. It creates a lot of challenges in building healthy community. You see people just tearing people down. And I say this to people quite often, that it's an oddity that I'm blessed to serve a community that checks in on its leadership and cares about us, alhamdulillah. And something I thank God for every single night. But when you're in this place of sincere conduct, that's not the idea, that I'm just going to catch you every time you slip or every time you make a mistake. And there's a lot of room to be able to do this within the prism of privacy that honors the rights of the person, the way Hassan and Hussein, they're not inflating their ego and elevating themselves by denigrating somebody, but there's love attached to it. They want what's best for this person. They don't want to make themselves feel good by making somebody else feel bad. Does that make sense? Right? And so here you have this notion relevant to us. You should be speaking out to people. Don't be scared. A lot of us are not reaching out to electeds anymore. You have full right and authority to be doing this kind of stuff. You should still be taking to the streets and protesting, right? The number of kafiyas that we see has dropped substantially in a lot of different gatherings and spaces. Do you know? But you also understand, I'm going to be in my own place, a shepherd of some kind. And so I have to be in a place where I'm willing. This man was willing to take advice from Hassan and Hussein, who were children. If a child told you that you weren't treating them well, how would you respond? When you were a little kid and you were trying to have your voice heard by an adult, did they listen to you? The Prophet of God is saying that the deen is nasiha, and one of the categories is to the people who are in charge. And it's not just you just give good conduct. You have to be willing to receive it. You got to be willing to take it. You see? And then the last category, wa'amatihim, and the common people, the people who are there, who are just everyday people like you and I. We fit dual roles of how it is that we are, recipient to advice and sincere conduct. You gotta have some people in your life who you're willing to hear from them when they're telling you again. Might not be an authoritative person, but just somebody who's gonna be able to tell you that you're not actually living right, man. And as hard as it is, you gotta be in this place. A lot of people don't. And that's why they have difficulty. Somebody who's been abused their whole life, they're not going to suddenly be able to hit a switch on themselves and they're recipient of the love that you give to them. It takes a different sense of tenderness and compassion. So the nasiha there isn't, why aren't you listening to me when I tell you that this is not good for you? You need counsel that says, how do you talk to somebody who's broken inside and doesn't even know that they're broken? To be in a place where you're able to understand the conduct now amongst us is not just in like, hey man, pick up the chairs, but in these broader themes. Sincere conduct at the level locally is we're reminding people about how all of this fits into the prism of what's worldly and what's otherworldly. It's not just in a vacuum, like, hey, you made me not feel so good, but the way you treat me, that's not going to stand up well when you stand in front of God. What are you going to do when you stand in front of Allah with all of these things? How is what you're doing right now make sense in terms of a world that comes after this one? And sincere conduct at that level is one that we want to start to think about in those ways. Other things that are embedded in this, sincere conduct, you don't like throw people's garbage out for the public to consume. If I open up to you about something that's going on with me, you gotta like conceal my stuff within reason. Abusive situations, oppressive situations, they don't fit into it, right? So the things people talk about today that should be hidden, and the things that are hidden are things that should be talked about. We don't tell people, oh man, we're gonna pretend like that we don't know that that dad abuses his kids. Versus, I'm going to put a ton of my energy into being like, did you see that boy hanging out with that girl last night? Or she was listening to this, or watching this, or dressed in this way, or that way. Privacy is a part of our tradition. Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiallahu anh, he sees somebody in his home committing haram. And he says to him, like, you shouldn't do these things. And the person says to Umar, why are you looking in my house? And he has to give in to this as a reality. Sincere conduct amongst us is that we are not a population that just pushes out without really thinking consequently about what we're doing. And the difference between someone who's kadhab and kadhib is whether you're actually even verifying the story or not, or just kind of pushing things out, having only heard one side of something. If you don't give an opportunity to somebody to be able to speak their piece in some capacity, what are you filling the gaps in the information with? Does this make sense? The Prophet says in a hadith that there is no person whom Allah gives authority over others, and He does not look after them in a sincere manner, except that He will not even get the scent of paradise. So you have responsibility as a shepherd towards like people more generally. The people you work with, the people who work under you, the people that you kind of engage in various ways. And that conduct is something that we don't necessarily like hear about so much, you know? Like you go to all these bookstores and there's entire sections about self-help and personal development. There's not sections that are about how do you treat others. How can you be a good Muslim if you don't treat people well? Right? It might sound a very simple statement, but this is what it is, right? Ad-dinu nasiha qulna liman. And the last category is for like just the people. The people who you can get away with not treating well. The people who don't have as much authority as you do. The people who, if you do right or wrong by them, there's fundamentally no recourse that they have. The Prophet is saying sincere conduct even with these people. What we want to be able to distinguish with here is what actual nasiha is versus what it is to just embarrass and shame somebody. This is an important distinction. So what I'd like for you to do is two things, just because I'm talking a lot. We're going to get to Maghrib in 10 minutes. What are some of the things that are coming up for people? And how do we distinguish this now? The difference between giving counsel versus just kind of breaking somebody down. What's like the two things, like how are they different from each other? Because the Prophet didn't break people down, he built them back up. Do you know? So how do I know that what I'm doing is actually building someone up or breaking them down? And we want to be in the former, bringing someone up, not breaking them down. So what does this look like? How would I do this well if I'm giving this nasiha to someone? If we could talk about this for a minute, and then we'll come back. And channel like stuff where you know you weren't trying to hear something from anybody, versus like when was it really resonating with you? You know, counsel and advice. And we'll come back and discuss, but go ahead.
I think there's two things. The first is the intention. This is a challenge I feel like I face a lot because like I'm pretty like a nice person and I don't like conflict, but at the same time you know, push comes to shove. I really I appreciate people calling me out because I really want to know. And then I'm still struggling to do that with others. The two things that I'm trying to have myself, like intention, right? So like knowing that you're doing it, not to just bring something down and just like to enjoy you know, just be like constructive. You might like what you know what I mean? Like, and the second thing is just like being like, first of all, don't do it in front of a group of people. Taking this do it very fast. I think those are like just some of those things that you make it more about a situation. Because, you know, it's a sensitive thing, right? People have different levels of embarrassment. Some people want to be like, oh yeah, I'm like, so you just have to like kind of like really know your person and balance. And then
No, that makes sense. I feel that.
yeah, for you especially.
Yeah. Probably confronting someone. I'm sure.
Makes them resentful too.
See, that's what you can learn about these concepts.
Okay. I thought Maghrib was a little later than it actually is. I think it's in a minute, right? 7:35. So just really quickly, we're gonna have iftar after Maghrib. They're gonna bring in some stuff here. Mondays and Thursdays, we're gonna be continuing our potluck iftars. If you're trying to make up fasts, you can do like the six fast for Shawwal. During these times, you want to bring stuff with you. That would be really great, just for all of us to kind of be able to eat together. And I'd recommend sticking around for iftar. It's a way for us to build community, kind of deepen in our relationships. I know a lot of us are missing Ramadan and some of the times that we had just being together every night for a month straight. So you can stay for iftar, that'd be great. We're going to have all the rest of our halakas this week that we normally would. So Dr. Murmur tomorrow, Dr. Marwa and myself on Wednesday, and Sheikh Fayaz on Thursday. Then Friday night, Imam Zaid Shakir is going to be here. You should come and listen to him. He's really great. He's going to give a talk at 7:30. Thanks so much. You're the best. And he'll give the khutbah on Friday as well. And then on Saturday, we're starting a new program. So myself and Sam, who some of you know, he's a public school teacher, but does a lot just in terms of nature. We're going to start doing monthly kind of a spiritual retreat, for lack of better words, but it's really like a reflection kind of experience as a community. The Prophet ﷺ would regularly practice what was called tahannuth, like he would separate himself from the society to seek solitude. We already have like 120 people signed up for Saturday. So this first one we're doing in Central Park, just so it would be easier to get to. And we can kind of work out the kinks, but we'll get people together, kind of have a short kind of framing, and really have people just sit and reflect together, and build that as a kind of key spiritual tool, what's called fikr, right? You're engaging in contemplation, reflection. We'll come back, debrief, pray dhuhr together, and then wrap up for the day. But try to come if you can. We'll send out more information on that as well, inshallah. So people can put their chairs against the wall. We don't want to delay Maghrib. Did Harith leave? Yeah? Oh yeah. Do one of you guys want to call the adhan for Maghrib? And then stick around for iftar, inshallah. And maybe during iftar we'll make a couple more announcements as well. Yeah.